I thought I would do is just do a little bit about the story so far, then talk a little bit more about the relationship between Churchwardens and focal ministry, and then we'll have our discussion, and maybe I will end with some ideas about what might happen next. So I'll begin with my story, a brief 1 minute. So I am a failed atheist. When I became a failed atheist in 1988, I started my journey towards ministry in the Church of England. And as part of that, in the 1990s, I did a 5-year stint as a churchwarden. They don't tell you, do they? No. So it is with some trepidation, but also great pleasure to be surrounded by lots of churchwardens, because I know I learnt a lot through that phase. I was eventually ordained in 2006. I've spent a bit of ministry in chaplaincy, but mostly I've been involved in vocations, theological education, and ministry formation. And 2.5 years ago, I was called and got brought to the Diocese of Sheffield. And I have spent the last 2.5 years spending a lot of time going and meeting a lot of people, many of whom I know are in this in the room today. So that's how I got here. How the diocese got here, and many of you will remember this. About 2 years BC, before COVID, the diocese knew that it was. I think we are on timing. So yeah. Good. It is working then. Yeah, good. About 2 years before we all got hit with COVID, the diocese did a big review. It, like a number of dioceses across the country, were facing a situation where we had less money, fewer congregations, and fewer people actually offering for traditional sort of full-time ordained ministry. So God wasn't calling people we couldn't afford to pay anyway. This diocese isn't cushioned by having lots of historical assets, and so had to decide what it was going to do about that a little bit earlier than most of the dioceses. What we decided was to move to a situation where we had oversight ministers and focal ministers. Oversight ministers compulsory, they will be looking after a number of different parishes. Focal ministers are completely voluntary, nobody has to do it, but we were sort of hoping a prayer that some people might actually offer to do that job. What's happened over the last 2.5 years is that I have discovered that focal ministry is actually a rather wonderful thing. But it's just not one wonderful thing. It works in different ways and in different places. Originally, the idea was to have one person per parish who would be a focal minister, a kind of mini vicar, if you like. That didn't work. In some places, it's exactly what is needed, and in some places, we do have one focal minister per parish. But in others, what has happened is that teams of people have been called together, each bringing their own unique gifts and callings and talents to a group of focal ministers. And over the last 2.5 years, what's happened is we have, it's actually 78 focal ministers now, because I authorised another one last Sunday, and very many very exciting people in the pipeline as well. So for whatever reason, focal ministry does seem to be working. And this is really, really exciting. It's working in different ways in different places. But whenever I go into a room, usually in a church or a PCC or somebody's front room, I ask 2 questions. One, who are the people that God has called around this table or around this room? Who are these people? And what are their gifts? And what are their callings? What have you wanted to do forever and ever and ever, and not really found an expression to be able to do that within the church and to be authorised, blessed and equipped to do it? And I then ask, what does your community need? Where does it really need God? I mean, God is out there already, obviously, but where do we need to put some energy in order to make the kingdom of God more apparent in our particular place? And amazingly, usually, mostly, almost always, the two are connected if we sit down and ask that question. And so what we've been able to do is make this thing called vocal ministry a device, a tool, if you like, to put those two things together and release them. So I'm going to move on to what is a focal minister. Well, a focal minister isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all, all looking the same. They all look very, very different. There's quite a few in the room, and they are all individual and very, very different. But there is an overarching framework within which that difference can be authorised and equipped. That framework is that a focal minister is someone who is a public face of the church in their congregation and their community. So they are offering to be a public face, photos in the porch, the go-to person. Usually they're already the go-to person. We're just recognising and equipping them and blessing them. Secondly, they, together with the oversight minister, if they're fortunate enough to have one, or the associate archdeacon, transition enabler, or whoever happens to be other leaders in that place, they're responsible for developing and delivering the ministry and mission within their parish. Responsible for developing, because usually people not only have been there for a very, very long time, they have a passion for their church and a passion for the community in which they live, and they will know what is needed. And so they're involved in putting together and developing that strategy, not as a kind of, this is a top-down thing, how we're going to make it fit, but rather as what is God at work at in this place, and how are we going to do that and make that and release that to happen. Thirdly, if there's a team of people, and as I say, the smallest team, we've got quite a few churches where there is one focal minister, but then there are others where there are more. The biggest team is 8, and that's up in Penistone, one of the first ones that we had. And they are serving 5 different churches, but they're acting as a team. In other places where it's a bigger church, we're looking at developing teams of 4, 5, maybe even 6 people. Whatever works in the kind of context is what we try and facilitate and enable to happen. In those larger teams, there may be people who feel called to take ownership and leadership and responsibility of a particular aspect of ministry and mission within that place. And so we have teams of focal ministers who work overall together in helping lead the church, but one of them may take responsibility for organising pastoral visiting. Or another maybe has a particular passion to do a certain sort of mission. I'm thinking of one who's got this most amazing online thing going. I don't understand it at all, but I do know it's working really well. Others are working with children and youth. Others are involved in running services. But as part of the team, a focal minister may take responsibility for leading a particular aspect. And finally, and possibly most importantly, all focal ministers are encouraged to recognise the gifts of everybody within the congregation. Ask them what God is calling them to do. And then that might not, not everybody is being called to do something really proactive. Some people may be being called to pray, and that's probably the most important thing of all. But fourthly, focal ministers are responsible for encouraging the gifts and talents and vocations of everyone. Now, anybody can be a focal minister. So churchwardens can be focal ministers, but don't have to be. Readers can be focal ministers, but don't have to be. Focal ministers can be lay or ordained. It does, but the laity and the clergy work alongside each other as equals in focal ministry teams. I want to move on to talk just about how it relates to the job of churchwarden, and then I'm going to ask if there's anybody who's got any questions. We'll have a time of question and answer, and then I'll have a little bit of time of summary at the end. So as churchwardens, I'm going to say we, I'm not anymore, but we know that we have particular responsibilities. We're an officer of the bishop, and there are certain things that we need to do. And thank you all for doing them, because they're not always straightforward and not always easy. That doesn't necessarily make people a focal minister, though, because some churchwardens, and I know at the time I was one of them, are particularly focused on the church building and the congregation, and keeping that core of our faith alive in the middle of our villages and towns. And that's not necessarily what focal ministry is. Focal ministry is much more a kind of public-facing, active in ministry and mission role. So you can be both. And because, as I say, focal ministry looks different in the different parts of our diocese, where it's a small team, and there are many places where it's a small team, then yes, the focal minister is the churchwarden, and what they're doing might not look that much different as a focal minister in terms of their overall responsibility, because they were doing so much already. Hopefully, what they do get, apart from authorisation, blessing and recognition, is some support and some resources, which for the next 2.5 years I should be working on quite hard when I know what it is that people really, really need. In other places, in bigger churches, it's an opportunity for people to take responsibility maybe for a particular congregation and lead a particular congregation. So that will look it will look different in larger churches. But what we're hoping to do with it is release people, even if we had got an oversight minister for one church. If we were in that situation, there's a heck of a lot of ministry needed. And so what this is doing is saying, hold on a second, is there anybody else that God is calling to a vocation ministry within this place? The answer appears to be yes in almost every place. And this is a way of the diocese keeping everybody safe, but also resourcing that as well, and giving people confidence to do that thing that maybe God is calling them to do.